I've noticed a bit of a pattern with Wuthering Waves' character releases, and how character popularity seems to influence game balance way more than I believe it should, so I wanted to talk about it. So that's what this video is going to be about. The premise that I believe Kuro Games has set with the recent character releases is the more popular a character is, the better Kuro Games tries to make them, turning the game's meta less into an actually interesting meta, and more so into a popularity contest where the most popular character gets to do the most amount of damage with the least amount of flaws. So let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, before I dive into why any of the popular units are not correctly balanced in my opinion, I have to explain what do I believe makes a character balanced. And when I say balanced, I mean that the character is strong enough to clear all of the endgame content while still having flaws that hold them back in some way, so that they don't just completely stomp on every piece of content that gets into their way and leaves room for other characters to outperform them in certain scenarios. Additionally, in order for a character to be balanced, they need to both have good premium team options as well as good free-to-play team options. Otherwise, we're going to get characters that, if you do not have their signature 5-star support, they start severely underwhelming you. All of these words to say that what I believe makes a balanced character is someone that will never make you feel bad for pulling them in some way, but also will not completely eviscerate everything that stands in their way, to the point where you just simply don't need anyone else ever again. Now first, let me start talking about a character that I think is balanced and why they meet these criteria in an efficient way. So the character I wanted to talk about is Changli. Now why I think this character is so well balanced is because if you really like Changli, there is always going to be a way to make this character good. It doesn't really matter what you do with your account, because Changli will be able to find her value in some places, especially if you're willing to invest. Now, while I do believe that Changli is not a perfectly balanced unit, as I believe her free-to-play hypercarry teams are underwhelming, she is still a lot more balanced than other characters. You're able to easily squeeze her with almost any DPS in the game, and it's usually going to be competitive with their best-in-slot team, meaning that if you pull your Changli, you're able to slip her into some Carlotta team or a Phoebe team, and it's going to end up working out well for you. So not only does she have a lot of options for teammates, she's also very rewarding when you learn how to play the character, rewarding you for skillful gameplay while not overly punishing you for being a casual. Because if you are a casual, you are able to pick up a Brand or a Zhezha, or if you're free to play you can use Sanhua in order to play a DPS Changli, and this is still going to clear the content. So overall, you are never going to feel bad about pulling for Changli on your account, because you can always put in the time and effort to learn her best teams, and if you don't have the time or effort to do that, you can just play one of her casual teams and you'll still do everything just fine. And Changli does have a pretty significant flaw that makes it so she's not always going to be worth playing over a different DPS, being the fact that her quickswap teams simply are going to be harder to use than most hypercarry teams. And if you play Changli as a hypercarry team with Brand, she is going to be performing lower than some other hypercarries she would be able to beat if you were to play her quickswap, which means that her performance is incredibly skill dependent. So now with that lengthy explanation out of the way, let's look at some recent characters that I feel are just not really that balanced in multiple ways. And the first character I wanted to talk about was Zani. Zani was one of the most hyped up characters for Renacita's release, so obviously Kuro Games did not want to disappoint with Zani as a character. And let me tell you, they definitely did not disappoint. Her gameplay is extremely fun and her animations are really good. She feels incredibly satisfying. But my issues with Zani start coming up the second we talk about her in a game design sense. Because if we are talking about how Zani was designed with her kit, I think that Kuro ultimately dropped the ball here. Now, one thing is for sure, Zani is incredibly strong. If you have her best team, Zani is in my opinion the best DPS in the game. While she has some of the best clears in all of Tower of Adversity, and also some of the best clears in all of Whimpering Wastes, ultimately leading to the most balanced DPS that's able to completely obliterate both game modes. And there's the word I don't like here. She's able to completely obliterate every fight, no matter what the scenario, if you play her in her best team. At the end of the day, Zani is ultimately left without a real flaw that enemies in the game can exploit. If you're fighting an aggressive enemy, Zani has tons of damage negation and damage reduction within her kit, meaning that dying with her is not going to be that easy. If you're fighting in AoE, Zani has tremendously good AoE capabilities, so that's not going to be an issue. You're fighting in multi-wave, Zani's damage is completely consistent throughout her rotation, meaning she's completely capable of just nuking down waves over and over and over again. As a melee character, usually you'd expect that she doesn't like it when enemies split up, but Zani will just drag herself across the floor to target the enemy anyway. What I'm trying to say is, Zani does not have a flaw that enemies can exploit. There is not a single way to turn Zani off once she's locked in. Zani's only flaw as a character is that her team is expensive. And in my opinion, that's a really cringe flaw to have. It's a flaw that you could easily solve by just spending money and pulling the best supports for her. And when you have those, there really isn't anything that can turn Zani down other than complete spectral resistance that would turn down literally any spectro DPS. At a certain point, there's very little reason to use any DPS that isn't Zani. And the only real way to justify using a different character compared to Zani is to just say, oh, well, this character has a higher DPS. And that's incredibly boring in my opinion. So not only is Zani incredibly hard to counter, she is also incredibly hard to justify pulling if you don't have and don't plan on getting a Phoebe. And thus she completely goes against my philosophy of a character that you should never feel bad about pulling. Another example of a character that I feel is not very well balanced is Carlotta. Now I will give Carlotta this, she's a lot better balanced than Zani. Zani really just doesn't have any flaw other than her team being expensive to get. So while Carlotta also wants to have a 5-star support, she's not completely gated by this support. And if you do not have Zhezha, you're able to make another team for your Carlotta extremely easily. You have Sanhua, you have Yang Yang, you have Taucha, you even have Brant and Cantarello for 5-star alternatives, meaning that in terms of team composition, I think Carlotta is completely fine. My issue with this character is just the sheer amount of damage that she does. Carlotta is still the highest damaging character in the game, with Zani and Phoebe being the next competitors. Carlotta's damage is incredibly high, and in some games, this would mean that the character has a significant drawback, which, to be fair, they did try to do that with Carlotta. A lot of Carlotta's attacks are incredibly low AoEs, basically just being a straight line in front of her. But Carlotta ended up doing so much damage that she straight up doesn't care, she just brute forces the content anyway. Because here's the thing, Carlotta is not pure single target. No, like I said, her abilities are in a straight line, which means you're able to completely solve the AoE predicament by simply just positioning her better. And sure, while you still might not hit every enemy, you have enough damage to the point where it really doesn't matter if you hit every enemy or not. So while there are ways you theoretically could counter Carlotta, she straight up doesn't care. Even if you throw extremely heavy glacial resistance her way, she doesn't care. She'll be able to clear anyway, unless it's straight up just everything is glacial resistant, with extra glacial resistance added on top. Remember the Sentry Construct that was here during Zani's Tower of Adversity? Yeah, Carlotta was gonna have a nightmarish time clearing that because of the sheer amount of glacial resistance. And that's the only real counter there is to Carlotta. So while Carlotta passes the requirement of never having to feel bad about pulling her with flying colors, she fails in the part where she doesn't make the entire game a joke. The only real way to turn literally anything into a challenge for her is to just throw glacial resistance on it, and I think that's pretty boring. And as you noticed, both Zani and Carlotta are incredibly popular characters, and I personally believe that popular characters should not automatically just be the top of the meta, because that ends up turning the meta into a popularity contest, which should simply not be the case. That ends up leaving people behind who like more niche picks. Now, I will say this in Kuro Games' favor. Kuro has been extremely good at making sure that endgame content does not get harder than it should be. When the Whimpering Wastes during 2.1 was too hard for people to clear, they ended up nerfing it into the ground during the 2.2 updates. But we have to make sure that Kuro doesn't get any funny ideas here. During the 2.0 update, the new Tower of Adversity meant to market Carlotta was a pretty significant increase in terms of the HP within Tower. And that alone would have been fine, but then they also decided to rework how Tower works, changing the 30% universal damage bonus into a 10% resistance increase and 10% resistance reduction, making it a lot less universal to play Tower of Adversity. They have since backpedaled from that HP increase, but still, it shows off that Kuro Games is looking for ways to increase the HP amounts in this game, which is something that we cannot let them get away with. And all of that brings me to Cartethyia, because I feel like Cartethyia might end up failing my standards of game balance even harder than Zani did. We already know from the fact that Cartethyia already buffs area erosion itself, that Shakona is going to massively increase the team's damage output. And not just that, also the fact that Shakona has buffs built into her kit, and has additional buffs with her signature weapon, as well as an extremely short rotation. So Shakona is going to give a lot to Cartethyia's team, and I would not be surprised if Cartethyia's damage ended up counting as erosion, making her even more reliant on Shakona than Zani is with Phoebe. And then as for the damage output, we don't know how much better Cartethyia's damage output is going to be than Carlotta, if it's going to be better at all. But based on the absolute chokehold that Jinshi had on the game when she was still at the top of the meta, I can definitely see Cartethyia completely outclassing every other DPS in the game, because she, much like Jinshi, is a Sentinel Resonator. So I'm scared. If every new DPS ends up really needing a 5-star support, the way that Zani and Cartethyia might, and if every single one of them is going to end up having no real weaknesses outside of needing specific teammates, we might be in for an extremely boring meta, where every character has no flaws other than being expensive. And I don't know about you, but I personally despise boring metas. It has single-handedly gotten me to stop caring about some games in the past. But that's just my 2 cents on the matter. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to check the link below to join my Discord. I'm pretty active in there, so if you ask your question there, there's a pretty good chance I'll respond. But that'll be all from me. Peace.